Hey, what's up, everyone? Dragon back again, here to tell you that you should be watching Dagon. So, Dagon is a 2001 Spanish horror film directed by Stuart Gordon. It is essentially a film adaptation of The Shadow over Innsmouth. Even though it's named after the earlier story, Dagon by H.P. Lovecraft, it's actually it's a telling of The Shadow over Innsmouth, and basically the main reason why they didn't call it The Shadow over Innsmouth is that one of the producers kind of felt that the title was a little long and a little too like, I'm trying to find the best way to describe it. Kind of like, well, what is that? It doesn't. It didn't feel like maybe it would grab people as much. It was a little too cryptic sounding. Whereas Dagon, as the producer kind of described it, just sounded almost like dragon, which essentially because it sounded cooler, and it dealt with the god Dagon to some degree. That is like, okay, it worked in terms of the relevancy of the name, and it just sounded cooler, I guess, than the name of the story that it's actually based off of. But right away, one of the reasons why this film kind of is pretty well known amongst H.P. Lovecraft fans that it is probably the best adaptation from page to screen of any of Lovecraft's work, matching the source material much more closely than a lot of other adaptations. But right off the bat, there are some differences. This takes place in 2001, not 1931, so it's not a period piece. Although, given how long ago 2001 was now, it might as well feel like one anyway. The other difference is it does not take place in New England. It takes place in Spain, mainly because it was the only way for them to get the movie made was to basically shoot it in Spain. So obviously the location was different. But beyond that, a lot of the story, plays out. A young character who basically just became a .com millionaire, and basically his girlfriend end up, shipwrecking off the coast of this small town in Spain. And where like the Shadow of Innsmouth's story, they come across this small town that's kind of secluded, kind of removed from the rest of the country, and whose people are different and interesting and take on peculiar physical attributes. But whereas the book was a lot more subtle, this story right away kind of kicks things up into high gear a lot more. The people are much more further along than perhaps you saw them in the book, and a lot of the themes and concepts that were introduced in the book, again, more subtly, are a lot more overt in this film. This film definitely plays on the horror element more so than the novella did. A lot of stuff in the novella was more subtle, more cryptic, more kind of that creeping horror. And while the film does have a lot of that, the film has a lot more kind of in your face, more like more kind of ballsy horror, if you will. But whereas the story I kind of talked a little bit about, whereas the book, I should say, the novella, dealing more about like our perceptions of people, kind of the outside looking in and the inside looking out. This story leans a little bit more heavy, interestingly, on like the religious side of it, something that was touched upon in the story, with the cult of Dagon. But it deals a lot more with like kind of religiosity and kind of how human beings really use religion to, in a way, make sense of notions and concepts that might feel too big to grasp or kind of beyond our scope of understanding, and therefore we have to kind of create an ideology or a dogma to kind of bind it all together with a set of rules and concepts and codes of conduct in which to conduct ourselves, just so we kind of understand how to operate within it. And really, explaining that a lot of these cults that you see and like Lovecraft's work is really not so much something these beings really want of us, but more or less are kind of primitive means in which to understand it, because what they are, the scope of what they are so vast and expansive and ultimately beyond what we can truly grasp, that the religions that we form around them are essentially just kind of humanity's primitive attempts to make sense of it by kind of reducing it into, again, dogma, so we can kind of get an idea of it. But ultimately, we're just scratching the surface, because to truly know it and understand it would break us, essentially. And basically, it's a little bit of a larger commentary, social commentary on religion as a whole. I mean, again, the film doesn't beat you over the head with this, but it shows you how a lot of religious practices that are being conducted by this cult in this film are in a lot of ways very similar to what you see other religions do, and some of the horrors that they commit, the atrocities that they perpetuate, are done so for the same reasons that were done so in our world. Essentially, it's just the name of the deity is different. They are worshiping a different deity, but ultimately they do the same things in the name of it, and you realize that humanity, for humanity, it really doesn't matter, which team you're rooting for. If I can use that as an analogy, it is more or less what we do when we do root for somebody, and kind of how we are essentially creatures of habit. That ultimately humanity is going to do what humanity does, and a lot of these belief systems are just kind of veils or kind of excuses to kind of justify it. But ultimately, it is kind of the yearnings, the primal calls and urges and yearnings of the human being that are really just shining through, and that we try to disguise it as something perhaps less bestial and more, noble by, wrapping it up in the guise of like a belief system, a dogma, because now it's for a higher purpose, it's for a higher power, it's for a greater reason, when ultimately the end result is the same. And you see the acts of barbarism in this film that mirror what has been done in reality, but for a different reason. Certain things that were done in reverse is a great little bit here where, not really spoiling anything, but where they wear people's skin on their heads, almost like a mask. And this was something that was done in ancient times, where they would sometimes wear like fish heads on their head, the kind of as like offerings to the sea for having a good catch, so you could feed your if you're a fishing, be able to feed your village. It's kind of basically wearing it almost as ornamental. Whereas again, with Dagon being kind of an aquatic deity, these people who are perhaps going under a metamorphosis of a certain kind, now wearing a being of the land in much the same way as they would have once worn the skin of a creature from the sea, kind of showing you that really it's just the aesthetic might be different, but the way they conduct themselves, the way you express a lot of this devout nature is the same. The only thing that really changes is what you're being devout to. But ultimately, humanity will be humanity, and that the religions that we kind of perpetuate are essentially just our way of trying to understand things that are greater than us, and that it doesn't really matter what it is. That's why a lot of all the religions seem very similar. They may feel different to those practicing them, but from the outside perspective, it all looks very similar. Again, you're just you're wearing a different team's jersey, depending on what your belief system is. But ultimately, having mass congregations, watching someone behind a pulpit, people committing acts of atrocity, worship and prayer, it all looks the same from the outside. It really doesn't matter what they're worshiping. Ultimately, how they behave is the same. So whereas the novella was more about a story of perceptions of really kind of what we consider normal and abnormal, and really what determines that is really more or less just points of view. This is more or less a bit of a social commentary on kind of why we feel the need to rally ourselves behind a belief system. And ultimately, no matter what it is you believe, people kind of express, themselves in a similar fashion within a belief system, regardless of what it is they believe. And a lot of times, what it is they believe is really the only thing that's really different from one another. And even sometimes it's not even that different. It's more or less just you still get together, you still have a set of rules, a code of conduct. People get together, for mass worship. Essentially, it's the need to find others like you and form that bond, that kinship, and the kind of the reaffirmation that you're right, what you believe is right, because everyone around you believes the same thing, and nobody around you is questioning it. So when you have an outsider come in someone who doesn't necessarily believe or someone who doesn't represent that belief system, they become a cipher, they become a pariah. They force you to kind of confront the notion that what you believe, that what you hold true, is not universal, and that there are opposing views out there in the world, and that becomes almost like a thorn in your side, and you want to correct it, you want to remove it, you want to get rid of it, because it is a reminder that there are others out there who are just as committed as you, just as devout as you, but for something that is in opposition to you. So Dagon, it is a really cool creature feature. It is again probably the best adaptation from page to screen in terms of Lovecraft's work. But it does its own thing with the story. It doesn't just feel like, well, if you read the book or the novella, there's no point in watching the film, which is one of the reasons why, if they were really just that close, I wouldn't have even bothered doing an episode of You Should Be Watching on Dagon, because I feel like whatever I said about the Shadow of Innsmouth would have basically been the same thing here. But there are different things to take away from both adaptations. A lot of what you would like in one or the other is there, but they both offer different things. They kind of lean more heavily on different aspects of the story. So it's kind of interesting to read the novella and see how Lovecraft approached this concept, this idea, and then see how the filmmakers approached it in the film. Again, both are good companion pieces, but they both kind of shine a light on more heavily on different aspects of the story, and kind of force you to kind of analyze different aspects of humanity while still telling pretty much the same story. So, with that said, Dagon, have you seen it? If so, what did you think? How do you guys feel it matches up to Lovecraft's work? And do you agree that this is the best adaptation, of Lovecraft's work, to film? And if you don't, feel free to say why you don't. And for those of you guys who have not seen this, I will leave links in the description section below. We can go check it out, give it a watch. It's a good movie. Come back, give me some of your thoughts. I'd be very curious to see what you guys think. And even if you're not familiar with Lovecraft, for instance, you're just horror buffs or creature feature, or like kind of like sci-fi horror, if nothing else, this is a fun movie, for that. But yeah, definitely come back, give me some of your thoughts, and also let me know if this now makes you more interested in reading Lovecraft's work if you have not done so already. But anyway, guys, thank you so much for watching, and I'll catch you in the next one. Peace!